Hello, everybody. So thank you to the organizers. Thanks to all of our speakers. And this is our last full session. I'm Christopher Nygren. I am Associate Professor of the History of Art and Architecture at the University of Pittsburgh and Director of the Program of Medieval and Renaissance Studies there. It is my honor and privilege to be hosting this panel with three great papers. So for those of you who have not been with us thus far, in order to save time, we are going to forego lengthy introductions. There will be a link dropped in the chat momentarily that will take you to a Google Doc with introductions to all of our speakers and also abstracts. I believe that we should have the captioning function back up and running. I think that's working within Zoom. In the previous session, it was hosted by an external source, but I think it's up. So we will go through the three papers, and we would invite you to write your questions into the chat at any time. I'm going to be sort of looking through those and monitoring those and likely calling on people at the end of the session to sort of read out or reenact their questions. And so please put them in the chat if you can, and that will serve as giving us a cue in order to get the conversation going. We are going to be recording this session, so if you have your camera on, you will be recorded, just to let you know. And if you don't want to turn your camera on, but still want to ask a question, just, you can send me a personal chat and I will read it out for you. So with that, we are going to turn it over to our very first speaker, James Clifton.
Thank you, Christopher. Okay, I trust everyone can see that. If I can.
Yes.
I'm trying to find my arrows. There we go. In his miscellaneous discourses concerning the dissolution and changes of the world, published in 1692, John Ray takes a digression concerning the primitive chaos and creation of the world, as he calls it, which he exemplifies with two ancient cosmogonies, biblical and Ovidian, quoting Genesis 1:1-2 and Metamorphoses, Book 1, lines 7-9. Most who acknowledged that there was indeed a beginning of things agreed that it was some kind of chaos, even if that specific term was not used in scripture. But what constituted that chaos was less easily definable. The beginning of Genesis is frustratingly obscure in describing primeval matter, as well as the process and pace of its transformation into the habitable earth. And in trying to understand and describe what this thing was, Christian authors also had recourse to pagan terminology like Ovid's rudis indigestaque moles, a rough, unordered mass of things. Both the Hebrew and the Latin of Genesis 1:2, tohu vabohu and Inanis et vacua, suggest somewhat redundantly a wasteland, emptiness, void, or vanity, without the King James Version's evocation of formlessness. The Greek of the Septuagint introduced an interesting inflection with the phrase oratos kai kataskievastos, unseen and unformed or unmade. How then could this unseen, empty chaos be visualized? Difficult as it is to name or describe primeval matter, it is even more challenging to depict it. One of the many plates in the monumental Voorbereidselen tot de Bijbelse Weisheid, the Prolegomena to Biblical Wisdom of Willem Goeree, Dutch publisher, art theorist, and amateur, albeit very learned historian, also turns to the two fundamental cosmogonic accounts and attempts to illustrate them. Above the circle in the upper register, he quotes Genesis 1:2. The earth was void and empty. The Dutch is using as woested and ledig. And darkness was upon the abyss. He adopts the translation in the States Bible. And below the square composition in the lower register is a declaration that it is chaos according to the thoughts of the ancient poets. In his text, he quotes the relevant passages from the Metamorphoses. Both of Hoy's compositions of the first creation and primeval chaos, to use Ray's terms, are derivative. The Ovidian depiction comes from a large engraving after Abraham van Diepenbeek, published in 1655. The four elements are represented as recognizable things: flames, clouds, water, and rocks in turmoil, along with some other motifs. But since I've written about this composition in Ovidian chaos elsewhere, I would like to focus our attention on Christian biblical cosmogony, or geogony, represented in the upper half of Hoy's plate, which derives most directly, but not slavishly, from illustrations to Thomas Burnet's controversial Tellurus Theoria Sacra, first published in 1681 and subsequently appearing in multiple editions, including the author's own English translation, The Sacred History of the Earth, from 1684. There are other images in Hoy's book that are very close versions of plates in Burnet's, and I'm showing one of them here, which I'll come back to. Burnet's images, in turn, derive from illustrations to Descartes' Principia Philosophiae of 1644. So there's a sort of genealogy of this particular scheme, though Burnet's and Hoy's are more refined and used in the service of a somewhat different geogonic theory. Medieval and early modern diagrams of the Aristotelian cosmos that follow conventions of classical and Christian natural philosophy, as well as European visual representation, are innumerable, and we might also think of the atlas Ben Weil showed us yesterday, exemplified here by these two diagrams. Although the Descartes, Burnet, and Hoy images take their place within this tradition, they are among the much less common representations of the cosmos before it arrived at its more or less stable form represented in such diagrams as these. Visual artists did not have the written text's luxury of vagueness. In their cosmogonies, they usually avoided creation's initial chaotic state and opted for the creator in the process of transforming the elements into the established world, whose forms are already recognizable. Thomas Burnet, clergyman, courtier, educator, and natural philosopher, felt he was living in the last age of a dying world, and wondered then, from so great a distance, some 6,000 years, as he and others reckoned, and I'm quoting him here, by what footsteps or by what guide can we trace back our way to those first ages and the first order of things, end quote. The answer for him was through reason and understanding, with which we are endowed by God, recognizing, quote, that in the present form and constitution of the earth, there are certain marks and indications of its first state, which can then be usefully compared with those things that are recorded in sacred history, end quote. Although he adduced a plethora of passages from throughout the Bible, his touchstone was less Genesis 1 with its 6 distinct days of creation than 2 Peter 3, which speaks obscurely of the earth standing out of the water and in the water, of the world overflowed with water, perished, and of the heavens and the earth reserved unto fire against the day of judgment. That is, Burnet's theory was more millenarianist than hexameral. I should also point out that though Burnet mentions the traditional 4 elements and accepted them as fundamental, he does not treat them as a group per se. Burnet argues from scripture and reason that God created a primeval chaos that eventually coalesced into a paradisiacal earth that was subsequently torn apart at the universal flood to arrive in the form in which we now know it. It will suffer another cataclysm, this by a conflagration, and be made anew as a second paradise for a 1,000-year kingdom of the blessed under Christ before its transformation into a star, what he calls its last dissolution, the consummation of all things. The various states are illustrated in the well-known frontispiece to his book. Within the body of the sacred theory of the earth, he describes and illustrates the phases from chaos to paradise. So essentially, I'm wanting to focus on this first part of this entire cycle. Burnet interprets the Mosaic Chaos as, quote, a fluid, dark, confused mass without distinction of elements and made up of all variety of parts, but without order or any determinate form, end quote. He comes back to it some pages later and describes it at greater length in conjunction with an illustration here at the upper left. The next 4 plates reading across the top and then the bottom row show the development from chaos to a paradisiacal world. In the second plate, the heavier elements are pulled toward a central core where they harden together and are surrounded by a layer of fluid, not quite as heavy. In the third, fatty elements in the fluid rise, separating from a layer of water. In the fourth, further fallout from the air mingles with the fatty fluid layer to form a slimy layer. And in the fifth and the final plate of this sequence, a purified air is left when the final precipitants descend to this slimy layer, which hardens into what is then the surface of the earth, ready for the paradise that God will create there. So Burnett's first plate here at the upper left is in effect a potential image, in that it has all the elements of a final image, just as the initial chaos is a potential world. And I'm showing details here so that you can see how his representational devices move from one to the next. Burnett's representational devices are methodical and consistent with his theory of the transformation of primeval chaos into the habitable earth. This chaos is represented by 4 distinct graphic forms, which I hope you can discern here. In the first of those is regular dense parallel hatching, constituting the entire circle. The second are dark, irregular, lumpish forms, themselves constituted by regular dense cross-hatching. The third constitutes thin, curvilinear branching forms, and the fourth, short, curved lines. These forms become clearer, and in the case of water, more ordered in subsequent plates as they are moved or removed to illustrate progressively Burnett's theory. Like many natural philosophers, Burnett reasoned from what could be seen to what could not be seen, whether down into the depths of the earth or back in time or both. Quarries may hint at this physical and epistemological obscurity. In his depiction here at left of the earliest state of chaos, the very beginning of creation, all the figures surrounding the images are blindfolded, and the theme of blindness is emphasized by the prominent appearance of bats. Gradually, over the course of the following plates, the blindfolds are replaced by veils, which we see in the plate on the right, which are then removed in subsequent plates for unobstructed vision. I conclude by returning briefly to the Septuagint translation of the Hebrew tohu to describe primeval matter, oratos, that is unseen or invisible. Not only did it play a natural role in Greek patristic writing on the creation, but it was also acknowledged by writers in Latin on the subject, who made the connection to instances in scripture in which the comparable term invisus was used, especially in reference to God himself. The earth without form and void then is as unseeable and thus unknowable as the creator, the invisible God. And the quest of the theologian, or naturalist, or historian, or even artist for the primeval chaos took on the character of the mystic's quest for the divine. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Those were some amazing images. I can't wait to discuss those in the Q&A. So just a reminder, if you've joined us, please feel free to put any questions into the chat. I will be keeping an eye on that, and we'll take all of the questions at the end of the session together. There is a link to the transcription, which is being run outside of Zoom, unfortunately for technical difficulties, but that's in the chat. So we are now going to move quickly on to our next speaker, who is Bronwen Wilson.
Thank you, Christopher. And I just can't exaggerate how grateful I am to have been invited to this amazing conference. So to the organizers, my really serious gratitude. So quarries and in-between spaces in some 15th century Florentine paintings. I begin with the desert, a landscape crafted from human and more than human forces. In Filippo Lippi's Preaching of St. John the Baptist, painted in 1452 to 54 in the cathedral in Prato, rocky cliffs meander across the surface behind the group on the left, transforming into extraterranean tunnels and caves that resemble quarries. The excavation, natural and human, of stone becoming architecture. The story of spiritual conversion unfolds from right to left. John takes leave of his parents. Journeying into the desert, he kneels between two caves in the middle right. He appears behind a rocky assemblage that evokes a pulpit, his right hand raised in a gesture of benediction. To the left, he stands on a sokol, preaching to a group gathered in a riverbed, the undulating cliffs behind him recording the effects of moving water long ago, now a desert marked with cracks. Vertical bluffs swell and recede, their surfaces recalling ancient aqueous forces. Dynamic undulations are interrupted by crevices that meander and by fissures that generate consideration of making and unmaking. Lippi's fresco, with its two-fold movement, recalls Leon Battista Alberti's discussions of mining in the dialogue The Origin of the Gods, written about 1440. There, Alberti writes, quote, "Nature has hidden away the gold and other minerals under enormous mountains and in desert places. We lively small humans collect it from the outmost and extreme regions and cut it apart, giving it new polish and form." Alberti's description highlights the labor and artifice of working stone and the journeys into mountains to extract it. Mountains fragment into perilous shards. They transform into dwellings for saints and demons, seen in the detail of Filippino Lippi's apparition of the Virgin to Saint Bernard, painted in 1486. With characteristic but serious wit, Lippi asks us to discern between book and stone. In doing so, we see how the material is never one thing or another. Bernard's study is neither architecture nor landscape. He is having a vision, one that moves us with him from the dark subterranean recesses on the lower right upward through the stacked slabs of the saint's study to the light on the left. Dante's Commedia is surely ventriloquized here with its infernal dangers, where vision is obscured, the labor of spiritual ascension in Purgatorio follows, and then the airy lightness of paradise. In paintings by Filippo Lippi, Filippino Lippi, and Sandro Botticelli, stone is neither finished nor unfinished matter. This paper explores these pictorial fabrications in the context of local quarries, practical knowledge, labor, and extraction of resources during a period of intense urban development in Florence. At least that's the context. The generative potential of stone in Sandro Botticelli's lithic imagery is particularly striking in its probing of geological and temporal themes. These stark landscapes with John of Patmos and St. Jerome are examples from the predella of his coronation of the Virgin in the Uffizi, painted about 1490. Lithic formations, disorderly on the left and neatly stacked on the right, metamorphose into large books, their contours emulating the manuscripts held by John and adjacent to the kneeling Jerome. During the 15th century, as Ivano del Prete's research into practical knowledge shows, the horizontal lines of strata seen in stones and connected to finding water were described as leaves, an idea presumably familiar to artists given numerous rocky evocations of leaves of paper in books. These fabrications in between the earth and the sky echo Botticelli's Palace and the Centaur, painted a few years earlier, around 1482 to 85. Consider the lithic structure on the left. Its syntax of elements is classical. Note the entablature, piers, and base, but like the Centaur, transhuman, transanimal, the rocky surround is neither fully architectural nor fully ruin. The painting was commissioned by Lorenzo di Pier Francesco de' Medici, who was also the patron for Botticelli's drawings of Dante's Commedia. There's a well-known connection between the palace and Centaur and the design for Canto 12 of Dante's poem. The scene illustrates the first round of the seventh circle, where the centaurs punish the souls of the violent. On the left of the sheet, a centaur takes aim at one of the damned in the river of boiling blood. The pose and raised hoof of the centaur in the drawing mirrors the painting in miniature. And I know these are hard to see if you're looking at a small screen. Botticelli investigated stone in a sustained way in his work on Dante's Commedia, a project that continued from 1480 until 1495. The rocky terrain of Inferno in the drawings and paintings is a vigorous protagonist. Its ragged chasms, fissures, pits, apertures, boulders, and bridges simultaneously enabling and thwarting the descent of the two poet travelers. Viewpoints are sometimes radically altered. In the poem, we see the topography of hell through Dante's eyes. This perspective is eschewed in Botticelli's variation in favor of a continuous narrative that requires us as subterranean travelers to experience this destabilizing geography. Sometimes we're nearby, navigating banks of rivers. Sometimes we see them obliquely, and sometimes from the other side of the structure, as in Canto 15 on the lower left, which is particularly startling in this regard. We seem to hover precipitously above Dante and Virgil, who tread cautiously on knife-edged banks. Our high position, however, is across from the steep slope on the other side of the narrowing funnel of hell, amplifying the danger of the river of blood that rushes down the chute. Claustrophobic and destabilizing, the depictions bear a striking resemblance to the quarries at Fiesole and Settignano. The mountain at Fiesole was excavated extensively during the 14th and 15th centuries for pietra serena, and these photographs have come to the fore recently. Stone was mined in two directions: falda, that is the strata parallel to the surface, and then recisa and mozzatura where they're cut off along the perpendicular axis. Consider again the drawing for Canto 12 on the upper left and the subject matter from Dante's poem. He describes the scene, the earthquake that shook hell at the death of Christ. Botticelli's paintings for the canto, with its slabs of stone turned askew, must have called up images of these quarries. Recall that the Medici villa was nearby, something I'm not going to go into. And for Botticelli and artists and architects, the dark and perilous caverns in which the Scalpellini and Cavatori labored must have called to mind Dante's infernal lithic geography with its contorted bodies. Still in 1546, the natural historian Agricola adheres to the ancient idea that minerals grow underground like trees. As evidence that stone grows, he cites the narrowing of tunnels as one moves deeper into the earth's surface. Stone was perceived as a living substance. And the strongest pietra serena that seems to have been understood by Brunelleschi because he used it for the Duomo was extracted from deep inside the mountain. The process created caves with columns in place for continued support. Generations of Fiesole Scalpellini described these as large camere. Evidence shows that Brunelleschi selected layers of the sandstone from the Trasanaia quarry, which is frequently noted in the records of the Opera del Duomo, where monolithic columns were quarried for San Lorenzo and the Loggiato of the Piazza Santa Nunziata during the second half of the century. Rough blocks cleaved from subterranean spaces were metamorphosing into the city's new architectural forms. Ovid's account of chaos and the cosmos is pertinent here. From chaos, for the ancient poet, quote, "The world is created anew and humanity is recreated out of stones." Creating worlds from stones resonates with Christian stories envisioned by Mantegna in his Madonna of the Rocks, among many others, circa 1466 or maybe 1488 to 90. The Virgin and the Christ child are enthroned on a crystalline rock with a cave that refers to her body. According to a 9th century abbot, the mountain from which the rock was cut was identified with the Virgin Mary. The rock was Christ, quote, born without conjugal labor, what Jakob Wamberg has described as lithic biology. Alberti dedicates a page of his De Re Edificatoria to this idea, noting marble growing in quarries, enormous stalactites growing by a waterfall, and big stones growing in the bowels of the earth to be brought to light later on the banks of a river in France. In the cave, stonecutters are at work quarrying and mining, which has been linked through the mythological structure of Pliny's natural history with the fall of the Iron Age and robbing Mother Earth of minerals and metals. This detail suggests internal forces, as Vomberg points out, the coming of being of art and external forces of mining and quarrying, the tension between those. It is this in-between character of these extant caves, I think, neither ancient ruins nor architecture, that reverberates in Botticelli's geological forms, such as his map of hell for the manuscript. A detail appears on the upper right, at the edge of the earth. The geologist Giambattista Vai has compared the lithic formation in Pallas and the Centaur with the deposits of a turbidity current, that is, the ripple marks created by flowing water with slurry found in the Apennines in Tuscany. Turbidites are characteristic of Pietraforte outcrop gradings that are seen here in Fiesole, described as an amphitheatro. These extraterranean deposits were both under and above ground. My larger project examines increasing control of access to quarries by the Medici into the 17th century. Recall the earthquake mentioned early from Canto 12, that in the Commedia becomes an upturning. And I'm thinking here about Walter Mellion's comments about subvertio. This upturning, the conversion in Dante's poem, is rendered by Botticelli in contrasting modes of pictorial representation. One goes down into hell and then comes up on the other side of the earth into purgatory. Perspective for Botticelli is suppressed in the subterranean space of Inferno, and the network of lines is dense. In Inferno, exemplified with Canto 12 on the bottom, blocks of stone resulting from the earthquake cover the sheet. In Purgatorio, the composition of space changes, seen here at the island plane where Virgil and Dante encounter the mountain. Like the two men, we see more clearly. With the increasing abstract and allegorical character of Paradiso, naturalism gives way to spirit and Botticelli's evanescent calligraphy. Heaviness and unyielding matter give way to lightness of air. In this last example, Botticelli's unfinished Adoration of the Magi, painted at the turn of the century, shows us monumental formations that oscillate between architectonic rock and prehistoric ruins. The artificial character of these fantastic outcrops, their obtrusiveness, stands apart from naturalism associated with landscapes. Different temporalities confront each other in these structures in formation, less pagan and Christian and more geological and bodily. Quarries, together with the transitory and temporal dimensions of stone they generate in painting, provide insights, I think, into artistic engagement with the genesis and with the destruction of worlds. And just to close, I'll leave you with this strip mining of sulfur at Pozzuoli from a German manuscript or a German printed book. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lots of wonderful images and things to points of resonance with James Clifton's paper, so there's going to be a lot to discuss. Just a reminder, if you want to put your questions into the chat, we'll be keeping an eye on that, and we will come back to them at the end after this final paper, which will come from Maria Lowe.
Great. I hope that's up. Okay. I would like to thank the organizers, as everyone before me has, and also to the audience that has remained to hear the last talk. I thought I would begin with an animated image because it is the end of the day on a Saturday, and I know we all have many places we could be. So let me begin without further ado. Can we think about this image for the next 10 minutes, please. Let me begin by giving you all of the metadata. We are looking at a detail from a sheet now in the British Library, written and illustrated by Henry Peacham. The page comes from a book of emblems, based on passages from the Basilican Doran, or the Royal Gift, a series of letters of advice that was written by the King of Scotland and addressed to his dearest son and natural successor, instructing him on how to be a good Christian, a good king, and a good person. Only 7 copies of the original manuscript were printed in 1599. But when Queen Elizabeth I died in 1603, James became the King of England and Ireland in addition to Scotland. Numerous editions of the text were reprinted at that time to celebrate the new Stuart monarchy. Peacham's hand-colored manuscript was gifted to the Prince Henry when he was only 16 years old. The manuscript consisted of 78 pages, each featuring a motto, a picture, an epigram, and a quote from the Basilican Doran. The king's advice is summarized here on this page in the motto, "Even in harshness, there is mercy," and shows a rainbow arching over a furious downpour in a landscape. Peacham's Latin epigram is sufficiently complex in construction, but relatively straightforward in its message, as is the text below. I will come back to these later, but we need to get moving because Prince Henry awaits us. As the firstborn son, Henry had been preened from his birth in 1594 to inherit the crown. When James VI of Scotland became James I of England and Ireland, the stakes were raised even higher. The Basilican Doran and Peacham's illustrated manuscripts were part of this program, as were these flattering portraits. Now, Peacham's rainbow emblem offered an important lesson for the future ruler. Rainbows were powerful signs, or rather, they were signs adopted by powerful people. It was, as some of you might know, part of Catherine de Medici's personal iconography. It appears in a painted enamel at the top left. It appears in a stained glass window that announces "Peace brings light." And again in Claude Paradin's emblem book that tells us the rainbow brings fair weather. Now, interestingly enough, in an earlier version of Paradin's devise, the same image was used and bore the motto, "I make alliances," without having any reference to the French queen. Apparently, the political messaging was there for the taking. Now, closer in time and place to Peacham's emblem, however, is the magnificent rainbow portrait of Elizabeth I, in which the regent holds in her right hand an arc of light. And in the space above, we find an inscription that asserts, "Without the sun, no rainbow," reminding the viewer that the queen's 2 bodies are both the spectacle and the source of power. And this brings us back to where we began. Now, rainbows could be generic, but their significance might also be co-opted. Peacham's quatrain begins, "Having embraced the roaring storm from the sky above, the rainbow declares at last there is an end to punishment." The text below from the Royal Gift, a direct quote, reads, "And when you have, by the severity of justice, once settled your countries and made them know that you can strike them, may you thereafter all the days of your life mix justice with mercy, punishing or sparing as you shall find the crime to have been willfully or rashly committed," etc. Now, these words may evoke Portia's rousing speech in William Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, which was published a decade earlier in 1600. "The quality of mercy is not strained," so on. The message here, however, is somewhat more urgent. Now, Book 2 of the Basilican Doran reflects upon the king's duty in his office. Above all, the young prince is cautioned against becoming a tyrant. "A good king," James I explains, "should be to his people like," and I quote, "a natural father and kindly master, rather than like a stepfather and an uncouth hireling. He must put their well-being above his own unruly private affections," end quote. In a further passage, which Peacham does not include in this in his footnote, The king continues and says that and expresses regrets about having tried too hard in his youth to, quote, win all men's hearts and creating disorder instead, end quote. This tenuous balancing act of justice and mercy is therefore one of the greatest challenges that a new ruler must face. Now, Peacham made 3 different emblem manuscripts after the Basilicon. Interestingly enough, in the very first one, the rainbow emblem is absent. This manuscript, which is now in Oxford, was dedicated to the 9-year-old Prince Henry in the first year of his father's rule as the King of Scotland, England, and Ireland. The second version, made in the following year, features for the first time the rainbow emblem, although with a slightly different epigram and image. I'm sorry, I only have this black and white reproduction to share with you. But in the picture, the connection of the rainbow to God's covenant with Noah is made explicit, for we see the ark nestled on the hill on the right. This illusion completely disappears, though, in the subsequent illustration. Now, the first and this one on the screen, the third versions were presented to Prince Henry, while the second was dedicated to King James. The theme of unity is highlighted here, not only in the picture, but also in the very first word of the Latin quatrain, complexa, from the verb complexare, to embrace. In the second year of his reign, James Charles Stuart optimistically declared himself the King of Great Britain, but this title and the unification that came with it met with much controversy and resistance in Parliament in the years between 1604 and 1610, thus contemporaneous with Peacham's project. Peace brings light, the rainbow brings fair weather, I make alliances, without sun there is no rainbow, justice with mercy. The political iconography of the rainbow would have resonated with the monarch, thinking anew of his eldest son and dreaming of the future of a unified and truly great Britain that they would build together. It was no longer merely a generic allegory. Peacham's rainbow spoke to the pressing political concerns that weighed heavily upon the Stuart monarch. Now, rainbows are beautiful, but precarious things. And we find this sentiment expressed in a personification of judgment in Cesare Ripa's Iconologia. The illustrated Iconologia was first published in 1603. And in this regard, it is born from the same decade that produced Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, 1600, King James's multiple printings of the Basilicon, and Henry Peacham's 3 illustrated manuscripts from 1603, 1604, and 1610. In the Iconologia, Ripa describes judgment as an elderly nude man seated on a rainbow. In a subsequent reprint from 1611, the graphism of the ark becomes more frenetic and more volatile. It seems as if the muscular old man is pulling in with all his core strength to prevent himself from falling off this messy rainbow. In the text, after describing judgment in predictable terms of cognition, measurement, intellect, and geometry, Ripa suddenly adds, now, to explain the rainbow, we shall say that everyone who rises to public notice in any way must learn judgment from a multitude of experiences, just as the rainbow results from the appearance of many colors brought together by the sun's rays. It has been suggested that there is no evidence that Peacham was familiar with Ripa while working on the emblem book. I don't have time to go into this point today, but let me just assert here that the rainbow emblem goes some way to destabilize such claims. But as time is short, let me get to my conclusions. And I promise these are the last 3 paragraphs. Ultimately, we must ask of the rainbow emblem, what might the teenage Prince Henry have thought when he turned to this page in the manuscript that Peacham sent to him as a gift, based on the book gifted to him by his father, the king? And what does it mean to gift a rainbow? Last January, shortly after Joe Biden was sworn in as the 46th president of the United States. The new president was presented with the landscape rainbow. This ritual traditionally occurred before the inaugural lunch, when guests from all political parties would have sat down to break bread together in a symbolic gesture of goodwill. In 2021, however, the meal could not take place because of COVID restrictions. The presentation, nevertheless, occurred in the rotunda of the Capitol, which had been occupied only weeks prior to that by insurrectionists. The painting was selected by Dr. Joe Biden, who was overheard at the ceremony telling Roy Blunt, "I like the rainbow," to which we hear the Republican senator respond in a moment of bipartisanship, "A rainbow is always a good sign." The painting, like Peacham's emblem, had to bear a great deal of political weight. The artist Robert Duncanson, the son of a Scottish-Canadian father and an African-American mother, was a self-taught painter who gained considerable fame among the abolitionist collectors in the Cincinnati region where he worked. The landscape with a rainbow was painted in 1859 on the brink of the Civil War. It was seen then, as it was again in 2021, as a sign of hope in a moment of darkness and instability. Peace brings light. The rainbow brings fair weather. I make alliances. Without sun, there is no rainbow. An elderly man balancing, fully clothed, thank God, on a rainbow. The political iconography of the rainbow would have resonated with the new president, standing in the recently restored rotunda and dreaming of the future of a unified America that he would help to rebuild. And what is rainbow power in the end, if not justice mixed with mercy? Thank you.
So thank you to all of our speakers. Great papers and many, many points of contact. So we've got a couple of questions in the chat already, which we will begin addressing. But if you have questions either for the panel as a whole or any of the individual speakers, please drop them into the chat. And so one of the things that the themes that I think really came out that was interesting, and there were two questions related to this, specifically for James Clifton, but I also want to kind of propose it to all three of the panelists. So in the particular question for James, it was there were two questions from Brian Ogilvie and Hannah Whipke about Robert Flood's illustration of Primal Chaos. And they put a link in there in the chat up above. I don't have the timestamp on it, but you can chase it down. And it's a kind of amazing page of just a kind of black box, and asking if there are any resonances, relevance, a comparison there. But so James, I want to ask you to give that question to you specifically, but I also think there are a number of questions raised by Bronwen's paper and Maria's paper about abstraction more generally, and these three papers which bring together a kind of unexpected thread of early modern art, which is the non-figurative or using the mimetic powers of art to get at things that are chthonic, primordial, Maria, in your case, deeply symbolic. So it is following a language that has a kind of grammar, but it is definitely stepping away from what we might think of as lifelike art. So so James, why don't we begin with you, and if anybody else has thoughts about abstraction more generally, we'll go there.
Sure, I'm going to take the liberty of sharing my screen just for a moment, just so that so that everyone will recognize that I was way ahead of you. So this is something that I had in there in the paper briefly, and then took it out. And when I was thinking about what to focus on in this paper, I had considered flood, but geez, flood. I might as well be Empedocles jumping into Etna or something. I mean, I hope someday to be able to wrestle flood to the ground, but I thought it made an interesting juxtaposition in any case, with an image from this very strange treatise by Otto von Veen, the Physicae Theologicae Conclusiones from 1621 as kind of exact opposites of each other. So anyway, there's the flood. It's a fascinating image. I've long thought that he would have been better served with mezzotint, which could give a really pure kind of black. And yet in the question, it actually raises the issue of doing this by hand, and in a way that somewhat recalls the Burnett plates with the cross hatching, although I think the flood is less regular. To the question of the sort of echoes of that, I don't know. I don't have an answer for that, and I'll certainly look for them. I mean, most treatises, most writing that treats this subject as we get later and later, especially around Burnett, they're very often unillustrated, or they're using similar images or something like that. So this strand that could be flood, I really don't know. I want to look for it. It raises a very interesting issue for me, and I sort of thought about this for a while and haven't pursued it fully yet. But this is a question of how is anything imaged without light? And one of the real points of debate about the hexameron is before the sun is created, where does the light come from? Was the chaos lighted in some way? And it sort of speaks to my whole sort of question about how you represent something that you can't see because it's distant in time, or it's under the ground, or in this case, maybe there's not any light, and it's something that is hard to imagine. But the flood also brings up the other issue about abstraction. And one of the things that interests me about this as well is that the things that I was showing are efforts of people to understand the physical transformations that took place at the beginning of the Earth. And so in their own way, they are serious sort of naturalist kind of investigations. To a greater or lesser extent, they want to coordinate them, to unify them with scripture, if they can. And so there's lots of sort of accommodation that has a lot to do with the way the beginning of Genesis is read. But they're sort of serious investigations. And so what interests me is that in a way, the more serious they become about understanding and representing the physical world, the more abstract their images become. So if you contrast those to, these images of God the Creator, and even Michelangelo, if you will, images which in some sense or in some way just really don't make any sense in terms of a kind of viable or authentic representation of either a Mosaic account or some sort of scientific account. And so it's almost like in order to arrive at a more realistic representation, the representations themselves have to become increasingly abstract.
So the question of abstraction is so interesting, and I've been sitting here thinking about it because of the fact that that's partly what really drew me to this issue of, sorry, am I unmuted? Yeah, I am. Sorry, I'm just going to change my, you can hear me, right? So the question of abstraction is something that I became really interested in when I started to think about underground spaces. So I was asked to do something on Dante, and I had been thinking about horizons for so long. I started to become intrigued by verticality. And when I looked at those images by Botticelli for a conference, I then came across these views of the quarries because of the fact that some of this material had started to become available. And there was something so striking about that view that made me think about this different way of being able to create a pictorial understanding of the inability to see through a kind of abstracted mode of depiction. So I think that that idea of abstraction is something that's right about this, for sure. I think one thing that I'm interested in doing with this, and it's maybe connected also to some of the things that came out with James's paper, is to kind of reassess some of those ideas about the non finito, about Botticelli's works being unfinished, about that kind of idea that things are, that somehow this is about the artist's idea, and to find ways that it's actually something about the potential of stone to be translated into painting that it kind of I'm trying to avoid it sounding like an environmental determinist argument, but that there is something about working with the ground and being in the ground and seeing these images that then become something that through the process of actually handling the material becomes something that becomes a way of seeing. So one thing that's connected to this project that I pulled the slide is also thinking about pietra paesina, which are the small stones that are quarried from the Arno River, and they're sliced, and then they reveal these images of ruins. So you have this kind of condensation of a quarry in miniature in these smaller kind of divine images that are uncovered when you would slice apart stone. So this idea of how kind of elemental forces become something that reveals forms of artistic thinking is part of that idea of abstraction that I'm interested in exploring. So.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, what I found really interesting in the illustrations of Dante that you showed us, Bronwen, is the way in Canto, I think it's the image of the punishment of the violent in Canto 12, the way in the upper right-hand corner, you have the stairs, and then the kind of blocks become increasingly more abstract as you get down to the bottom where the people are being punished. And it's almost like the abstraction of line contributes to their punishment so that, they don't have a kind of naturalistic point of reference anymore. Yeah. It's almost like returning into the chaos. So I really liked, I love that one image where you have that progression from I was thinking of the kind of difference between rocks and blocks or blocks and rocks and how that moves very quickly there. Just very briefly with the rainbow, one of the interesting things about the rainbow is that it's something that is a natural phenomenon that people can see. Aristotle's model presents kind of a 3-band red, green, and purple, which is a broad spectrum of the rainbow. But then in subsequent authors and kind of artists, etc., you get variations on that. And sometimes they're reduced into 3 because there's all sorts of nice Trinitarian symbolisms that match that. More often than not, there's red and green referring to the elements of fire and earth, of water and earth, and sometimes 2 bands as well, which is what we see in that 1611 Ripa. I'm not really familiar with when the idea of color waves of light becomes articulated, visualized, and theorized in science. But it seems that there's something about the frenetic energy of that second rainbow that seems to already be inching towards this idea of trying to visualize color waves, for lack of a better term. So all of this is to say that the elemental forces are such a wonderful place for artists to take something from the observational world and then completely turn it into an abstract, imaginary, artistic undertaking.
Could I just add something quickly onto that, which is, I think, a connection between the 3 papers as well, which is the role of alchemical thinking, that this is a part of that idea of transformation. I was thinking, Maria, with your rainbow, the idea that the rainbow makes alliances, and that is one of the aspirations of alchemy, right? Is that you can improve relations with others through this transformation of base substances into something that is crafted, and that's the kind of chaos to form that is also a part of of the kind of Ovidian genealogy that is being traced in James's work, I think is also similarly connected to some of those ideas, the kind of alchemical processes of like a kind of conversion from one thing to another.
Yes. Yes,
So,
that kind of, yeah, turning something base into something pure. Yes, absolutely.
yeah, and we've got a bunch of questions coming in, which is great. I know Tamara Golan has a question. She can't turn on her video, but can you said you can turn on audio. Would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, some of these questions have already started, answers here have sort of addressed what I was trying to work out there in that question. But, you know, Bronwen, just thinking more about, and hearing you here talking about these like stones that open up and seem to have kinds of transformations in size, but the ways in which the kind of really evocative perspective in these images is also maybe trying to kind of recreate that in the kind of experience of beholding the image. Like the gaze is a kind of excavation of the image itself. I don't know if you was thinking more. Yeah.
Well, in fact, that's something that relates to I've also been working on Lugozzi's descrizione of the mountain at Laverna, which was also believed to have been formed by an earthquake. And in that book, you have this contrast between perspective that really organizes the viewer clearly in terms of the devotional, the devotional focus, and then these rocks that you peel back from paper that then reveal the process of manipulation, and also the kind of instability of walking through that kind of terrain. So that idea of kind of disordered experience that's embodied to then something which is about a clear kind of perspectival mode of vision, I think is something that is also kind of already in these works. So thank you for that as well.
And I know on a sort of related theme, Ivano del Prete had a question about the discussion of mines and quarries that was brought up by Christopher Hoyer's paper earlier. So I'm sort of wondering also, you know, not just for you, Bronwen, but also James, there was an interesting moment in one of the illustrations you showed that had Christ on the top of the 7 orbs that seemed almost to illustrate continental drift. There were, you know, the continents kind of like appearing underneath layers of chaos and nothingness. And I'm interested in hearing you guys talk a little bit about the role of subterranean excavation as it plays out as a kind of theological concept, and then as a kind of economic one in Bronwen's paper, and the links that were there to Christopher's paper from earlier today. So maybe we'll begin with Bronwen and then go to the theological abstraction.
Maybe I can also just quickly say to Ivano, it was such a pleasure to be able to meet you after having heard you talk about this material. But I'd actually pulled the image of Durer's quarry from my talk and kind of redid this morning quickly, thinking that it was better not to include that. But I think that there are really interesting dynamics between material from Northern Europe, images of stone, and I've been trying to think a lot about some of the differences with them. But I do think that there's something at least in the kind of Tuscan context, where there is a striation, this kind of emphasis on quarries rather than mines is something that kind of highlights things that are striated as opposed to something which is connected more to the kind of mineral mining that's happening in Germany, for example. But that's just kind of to start off the discussion.
As to the Burnett plate, you know, his main interest was actually the deluge, was explaining that. And so in a sense, he was working back from that to try to figure out what kind of an earth would allow that much water to cover the face of the earth. And one of the ways he figured it was that before the deluge, there were no mountains. And because part of the problem is how do you get the water, you know, above the mountain tops. And so his idea then was to have this external cross, and Ivana, you probably already know this, but to have this external cross over a layer of water. And what happens at the deluge is that there is a rupture of this external crust and the water comes forth, and it also rains. But the end result then is the irregular surface of the earth. And so what's happened with the deluge is that mountains are created and crevices and so forth, which Burnett describes over and over again as a ruin. So he talks about the ruined earth, the one that we know, and it actually became kind of an interesting issue in the 18th century for landscape painters in Wales, where Richard Wilson was from. Sometimes they would. There was a sort of they would describe a landscape as Burnett's landscape as this ruin, and yet be at the same time, even Burnett recognized that there was a certain sort of picturesque quality to these things. But it's only after it's post-Diluvian that there is any kind of excavation, as it were, of the earth.
Great. So there are still a number of questions that are alive in the chat, and hopefully people will have a chance to look at them. I am aware we're at the top of the hour now, and we are going to just take a very quick 2 or 3 minute break so that people can get up, stretch, grab a cup of coffee, do whatever you need to do, and we'll be back in about 3 or 4 minutes for some concluding remarks. But thank you so much to all of our speakers, and if you would like to stick around to discuss, please do. So thank you all.
Yeah, I do just want to say I will say a few things, but this will mostly be a chance for discussion for all of us. So maybe some of the questions that didn't get asked for this session can come back in.